everybody, so now we are going to really get into Docker Swarm, which is how we are going to take our application and deploy it across multiple nodes, maybe deploy multiple applications across multiple nodes. Really, really cool stuff, because this is when you can really start to scale and deploy your applications. So before we actually get into how to initialize your Docker Swarm cluster, I want to just take a minute to talk about the difference in the actual configuration files, because I really want to keep on hammering home this point that everything is just a layer, and all of these layers build upon each other. So first we had, our Docker file where we built a single Docker image, and then we went and we looked around for, wonderful Docker images that other people have already built for us. We learned how to put those together, how to compose those services in Docker Compose, and now we're going to say, okay, we're going to use Docker Swarm to scale and deploy those services across multiple nodes. So as you can see, everything is really a layer that builds upon itself, and I'm going to show you that directly with the configuration files. So what we have here is our, this should look pretty familiar by now. We have version 3, we have our services, and I'm actually going to show you guys, first of all, the exact same application that we used earlier, which is the Flask app server. And so you should be in the build Flask app Docker Swarm project download right now, which is listed for you below. So the application that we want to deploy is this Flask app server. This side over here on the left is our Docker Compose for Swarm, and this one over here on the right is just our regular Docker Compose that that you've been seeing all along. Okay, so what we have here is we have the Flask app server over here on the Swarm side. The major differences are that right here we have to specify an image, and this is not optional, like we have to specify an image. So, if you're following along before, you should have seen how to build and then deploy your image to Quay or to Docker Hub. If you're deploying it to AWS or like Google Cloud or anywhere like that, the instructions will be a little bit different, but they're not too bad. If anybody wants kind of a video or has a question about that, I can also do one of those. So we have to have an image. It either has to be publicly available or you have to have, the credentials to get it. In this case, this is a publicly available image, so go ahead and grab it. Before, when we are in Docker Compose, we were actually using a build context and we were building locally. And that's because I assume when you're using Docker Compose that you're still on like that development layer, you're still in development time. You want to be able to make changes to your files, have them reflect in real time. You're probably, either on a dev server or even on your local computer. So that's why that is set up like that. You could also, use an image if you wanted to, and put it, directly in the Compose service as well. You can see that we did that down here with Nginx. So once we have that, okay, we have our image, we've developed it, we've deployed it, we're all set there. We have our ports, okay, and then we also have our environment, our environmental variables, which is a bit different than the other one. And we have this environmental variable called service ports. And that we have that because of the method that we're going to use to deploy and load balance this application. And I'm going to get to that in a minute when we go down to the proxy service. So you can see that this looks pretty much like here when we have the ports. Okay, and then the two major differences, that we didn't see before are this deploy key and the networks key. So we have a deploy key. Deploy is very much what it sounds like. It's like, okay, what are the rules? What are the rules of war here for deploying our application? Here I have the replicas. I have replicas is how many instances you want running at a single time. The update configuration. So when you want to make some updates, which you can do, like you can update your Swarm configuration specifically from the command line, how many images to update in parallel, which is 2, and the delay I have set here is 10 seconds. I mean, you can play around with these a bit. They're not a huge deal. I found these ones to be pretty good for whatever I'm doing. What are we going to do as a restart policy? This is really handy. You can actually say when you want for this to restart. I have it set on failure. It will try 3 times, and it will put in 120 seconds between each time. So say you start up your application and then it fails, Docker Swarm will wait 120 seconds, and then it will try to bring it back up, and it will do that 3 times before it just says, all right, this is not going to work out for us. And then I have a placement, and the constraints are that we want this node role to be a worker. So you have worker, and you have, I think they're called manager. So you have manager nodes and you have worker nodes. In general, you're going to want for your load balancer, the kind of, the spider in the web, I sort of think of it as being on your manager node. And then all your applications are going to sit on your worker nodes. All right, so that's how that goes. And then if you remember, we did see this networks earlier, but it wasn't like too important for what we were doing. Now for Docker Swarm, it is important. We do need it. So I have a network created called web, and we're going to get to that once we get to the bottom of this file. All right, so you can see, I mean, these are the extra, this is the extra layer, this is the deployment layer on top of the Docker Compose file, which we saw earlier. And then once we have, so we have our application, and then we need to put it behind a load balancer because in general, like if you want to deploy multiple instances of the same thing, you can't have the same application exposed on the same port, so we need some way of dealing with that. Obviously, we don't want to have to write up like custom scripts that are, randomly looking for ports and things like that. So we use what's called a load balancer. And Docker has, quite a nice one that's built in right here. There are other ways of doing this that I'm gonna show you a bit later, because I don't think this is the most robust way, but in terms of like just getting started, or if you have just a single application, I think this one is probably the easiest way. So we're going to say this is the image. It's an image provided for us by Docker Cloud. It depends upon this Flask app server. These are some environmental variables. The mode is TCP. That's the ports. If you don't know anything about ports and the way that they're handled, just leave this. Don't touch it. It's fine. This balance is equal to least con. Oh, actually, I have some things in here from a different configuration. I have like a couple configurations, a few configuration templates that I just use like over and over and over again. So sometimes I get kind of funny things. You can also have this volumes key. So you can see over here in our Docker Compose, we have this, and you can see that we also have it here. It's fine. You can have it everywhere. The only thing that you have to pay attention to is that one, you have to pay attention to file permissions, and 2, if you're using multiple nodes, you need to have something like a mounted file system that's available on all of those, with the exception being, of course there are exceptions, but if you're using something that's the same across all the nodes, then like for instance, this var run docker sock, this is going to be the same. Because this is actually like the Docker process manager, and we mount that everywhere, or we bind that volume everywhere so that it knows what it's talking about. But if you were using this for kind of like development purposes, which I would kind of steer clear of, honestly, you just have to make sure that that volume is available on all of your nodes, okay? The default port for this service is port 80, which I rarely have open on my computer, so I have this set as port 3005. Again, you can change it. It doesn't matter. Just make sure that it's an open port wherever your environment is. Once you have your networks available, web, and then once again, so just to be clear about this, networks and deploy, that is our layer on top of Docker Swarm. The network is web, the deploy, the only thing that I have here is just a placement constraints. Make sure that you put this on the manager node. And then from here, we have our networks. We have a web network, and this is important. There are a few different drivers that you can use for your networks, but the one that you use for Swarm is always going to be overlay. I'm sure that as soon as I say this, there's going to be a release, and then it's, and then there could be different options or different things. But for right now, this is overlay. At the time that I'm writing this, that's what it is. The networks is something that's changed a bit, I've noticed, over the different releases of Docker. So, that's it. You have your application, maybe several applications. You throw a load balancer in front of them. It's all good. Up here on top, I always try to start off with some comments of how you kind of get things going. So I'm going to close out this Docker Compose file. We're going to get into this later. So when we're running commands to actually manage the cluster, it's going to be Docker Swarm. And then when we're running things for our like particular stack, it's going to be Docker Stack. You know, before it was Docker Compose, now it's Docker Stack. And then there is a little bit more going on with this one. Then everything is listed as a service, so then we can kind of query our separate services. You can also scale your services directly from the command line. Then, you know, when things get stuck, and of course things occasionally get stuck, how you can remove them, how you can remove your services rather, and then you can redeploy your stack or clean off all the images or whatever you need to do again. I'm also going to show you a couple of really nice web interfaces that you can also use for this. So that's it for this lesson. This was just meant to be kind of a bit of an overview of where we're going from in terms of using Docker Compose to Docker Swarm. In the next lesson, I'm actually going to show you how to initialize your Swarm cluster. And I'm going to be doing that with AWS, but I'm just going to show you exactly how to do it just in terms of like acting as if it's any kind of server. So that's it for this lesson, and I will see you in the next one.